The Middle East remains tense amid this fragile temporary truce, even after President Trump backed down from his threat to eliminate a, quote, whole civilization in Iran.
And joining us now to discuss what's going on, the former Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Congresswoman, thanks so much for joining us. I know you recently called for the president to be removed from office under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution after that threat that he made about destroying the whole civilization of Iran. The president has a long history of shocking and unprecedented social media posts. Why was this the final straw for you?
Because it's absolute madness. How can any person that is mentally stable call for an entire civilization of people to be murdered, to be wiped out, to never come back again? That's what the president called for. And that shows that there's serious instability in his thinking, that he would, not only would he even say that in a private room, perhaps with his advisors, but actually go to his megaphone, his Truth Social, and post that.
Welcome back to the show. John here as always. In early April, Trump posted a threat to destroy every power plant and bridge in Iran, a social media statement that sent shockwaves through the political establishment. The warning was just the opening salvo of an escalating crisis. What followed over the next 10 days would fundamentally alter the political landscape of 2026 inches, ways that most Americans are still struggling to fully comprehend. This wasn't the usual partisan bickering that fills cable news segments. This was something altogether different, something that brought together the most unlikely coalition of voices in modern American political history. And at the center of it all stood a constitutional mechanism so rarely discussed that most Americans couldn't even explain how it worked. The 25th Amendment had suddenly become the most talked about provision in the Constitution. And the conversation wasn't coming from just one side of the aisle.
For the entire country and the entire world. And it's unreal. This should never be tolerated. I know it's a very difficult, hard stretch to see it actually coming through, but the conversation needs to be had, and he's out of control, and people within the administration need to step up, take responsibility, and rein this in.
And administration officials, as we've heard, have said that he was ready to follow through with this threat. Just hours after he made it, he announced this 2-week ceasefire that's still very tenuous at the moment. The White House is claiming it was the president's tough rhetoric that brought Iran to its knees. What do you say to that?
I'm sorry. That's not tough rhetoric. It's insanity. It's calling for the murder of an entire civilization of men, women, children, of innocent civilians. That is not what I would call proper or even decent negotiations. There should be negotiations happening, and they did happen.
The first post landed on Easter Sunday morning, a time when most families were gathered around tables, sharing meals and celebrating renewal. But the president had something else on his mind. His message was direct, unflinching, and immediate. He demanded that Iran open the Strait of Hormuz, and he attached a deadline that left no room for interpretation. Tuesday would be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one, he wrote. Open the strait or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Now, the administration would later attempt to frame this as standard diplomatic pressure, the kind of tough talk that presidents have used for generations to signal resolve to adversarial regimes. But the language itself was anything but standard. This wasn't the measured rhetoric of traditional statecraft. This was something raw, something that landed differently in a world already on edge about the Middle East. And the reaction was immediate.
And J.D. Vance, the vice president, was the one that helped bring that ceasefire. It doesn't seem to be much of a ceasefire, but it is supposedly a ceasefire. And that happened through negotiations through J.D. Vance. And J.D. Vance did not go to his social media and threaten to murder every single man, woman, and child in Iran. Presumably, we can only presume that that would happen through nuclear bombs, because that's the type of horrific weaponry that would be used to wipe out an entire civilization. So no, I push back on that. And I think the American people fully agree. Everyone was outraged.
I just want to be clear, Congresswoman, do you genuinely believe President Trump had the intention of killing Iran's entire population of more than 90 million people if Iran had not agreed to a ceasefire? Is the U.S. military, for example, even capable of that?
I don't think that our good men and women in the U.S. military would want to even carry something like that out. That's the other thing. And I think that's important to point out. Our men and women in the military are the greatest among us. They're serving our country, defending our freedoms, and I'm so grateful to them and I support them so much.
Within hours, senators who had been largely silent on Iran policy found themselves compelled to speak. The phones in congressional offices were ringing off the hooks. The social media platforms themselves became battlegrounds where legal scholars, foreign policy experts, and ordinary citizens alike tried to process exactly what they had just witnessed from their commander-in-chief. But the story didn't end there. If anything, the Easter Sunday Post was just the opening act of a drama that would intensify dramatically just 2 days later. On April 7th, the president returned to his social media account with a message that would become the defining moment of the entire controversy. The post was brief, chilling, and almost impossible to ignore. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Snopes verified the post as authentic. Multiple news organizations confirmed it originated from the president's verified account.
But we should never have a commander-in-chief that would call for the great men and women of the United States military to wipe out an entire civilization and put that on their shoulders. And, you know, we've already got so many veterans that live with PTSD every single day in America, that can't sleep at night with terrible nightmares of the wars that they fought in foreign lands, foreign wars in foreign lands, not for America, for foreign countries and foreign purposes. And this is what the president was talking about. So I can only take him at his word because those are the words that he spoke to the entire world.
I just want to follow up with that. I mean, the White House has denied they were going to use a nuclear bomb. But for critics of Trump, they're like, you know, look, how can you say no one saw this coming? Obviously, calling for the death of a whole civilization is at a different level. But as Wolf mentioned earlier, Trump has been known for his bombastic rhetoric, right? He's been doing that for years. And you used to be a supporter. Now you're speaking out against him, but people might be asking, well, I mean, didn't you see this coming?
The White House notably did not deny the post was real. They instead attempted to contextualize it, noting that the same message included language about a potentially revolutionary, wonderful outcome if Iran agreed to a deal, and ended with a blessing for the great people of Iran. But the damage was already done. The words that everyone read first, the words that dominated headlines and cable news chyrons, were the threat of civilization's end. And in the context of a sitting American president discussing military action against a nation of 90 million people, those words carried weight that no amount of later context could fully erase. The legal community immediately began weighing in with analyses that went far beyond typical political commentary. CNN ran a segment asking whether threatening to end an entire civilization could potentially violate the laws of war.
Well, you know, I've always been a supporter of President Trump for the policies. That's what I cared about. But once he became president, he changed his policies. What we campaigned on was no more foreign wars. And President Trump said he was going to be the peace president. Well, he's gone from being the peace president to the war president. And I don't support that at all. I'm not offended oftentimes by people's words. I mean, people on the right and the left have lots of different types of language and statements. However, it's their actions that is what I pay attention to. And the president lost my support when he covered up the Epstein files and called me a traitor and wanted to primary me because I supported women that were raped at 16 and 18 years old, or 14 years old even. And I don't support the president in going to war in Iran. And what we campaigned on and what President Trump promised America was to put America first. And now we've got rising inflation, gas prices are going out of control, but we also have to put the blame on both parties.
Harvard's Human Rights Center published an analysis comparing the president's language to rhetoric that had preceded atrocities in other contexts throughout history. Legal scholars who had spent careers studying constitutional law and international jurisprudence found themselves confronting questions they had never seriously considered before. And then came the political response, which unfolded with a speed and breadth that genuinely surprised even seasoned Washington observers. Senator Chris Murphy, who had been a consistent voice on foreign policy matters, posted that if he were in the president's cabinet, he would spend Easter calling constitutional lawyers about the 25th Amendment. Senator Andy Kim went further, stating publicly that he believed the president should be removed as unfit for office, advocating for the 25th Amendment and impeachment as viable pathways. Bernie Sanders, never one to mince words, called the posts the ravings of a dangerous and mentally unbalanced individual. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, described the Easter Sunday Post as the words of someone ranting like an unhinged madman. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries urged Republicans to put patriotic duty over party and help stop the madness. The Democratic response was swift, unified, and unmistakably urgent. But here's where the story takes its most surprising turn. The response wasn't limited to Democrats, not even close. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had been one of the president's most loyal and vocal defenders for years, posted something that made political observers do a double take. She wrote the words 25th Amendment with no qualification, no hedging, no attempt to soften the message. She followed it with a statement that no single bomb had dropped on America and that killing an entire civilization represented evil and madness. This was not a normal political moment. This was a signal that something genuinely extraordinary was happening inside the coalition that had historically protected the president from virtually everything. When one of his most visible supporters publicly calls for the 25th Amendment, the political calculus changes in ways that cannot be easily dismissed. The NAACP, an organization with a long history of civil rights advocacy, made a formal statement calling for the amendment's invocation. For an organization that had existed for over a century to make such a declaration, for the first time in its history, represented a moment of genuine historical significance. Senator Ron Johnson, a Trump ally who had consistently supported the administration's policies, publicly stated that he didn't want to see the U.S. blowing up civilian infrastructure and called the rhetoric bluster that wasn't real. The breadth of the reaction told a story that went beyond partisan politics. Conservatives and liberals, establishment figures and outsiders, veteran lawmakers and freshman representatives, all found themselves responding to the same presidential posts with a level of alarm that crossed traditional political boundaries. 9 days after the initial Easter Sunday post, the conversation moved from social media and cable news to the floor of the House of Representatives. Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland formally introduced legislation that would create something called the Commission on Presidential Capacity to discharge the powers and duties of office. The bill was 10 pages long and came with 50 co-sponsors, all Democrats, all willing to put their names on a document that formally challenged the president's fitness for office. The proposed commission would consist of 17 members, including 4 physicians, 4 psychiatrists, and 8 former senior executive branch officials. Under the bill's structure, congressional leaders from both parties would appoint equal numbers of commissioners, theoretically creating a bipartisan body that could evaluate the president's condition with some degree of objectivity. The commission's findings would still require the agreement of Vice President J.D. Vance to actually go into effect, a recognition of the constitutional reality that the vice president plays a central role in any 25th Amendment proceeding. Raskin said publicly that public trust in the president's ability to meet the duties of his office had dropped to unprecedented lows. He cited the Iran threats, the chaos in the Middle East, the social media posts, and what he described as the president likening himself to Jesus Christ online. The cumulative effect of these factors, Raskin argued, created a situation where the American people needed some mechanism to evaluate whether their president remained capable of discharging his constitutional duties. Now, everyone involved in the legislative effort acknowledged that the bill faced virtually insurmountable odds. Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress. The president would almost certainly veto any such legislation if it somehow reached his desk. The math simply didn't work for those hoping to see the bill become law. But Raskin and his co-sponsors introduced it anyway, and 50 members of Congress signed their names to it, understanding full well that the legislation would likely go nowhere. This raises an important question about political strategy and the use of constitutional mechanisms as messaging tools. Critics on both sides of the aisle pointed out that the bill was essentially performative, designed to generate conversation rather than actually produce constitutional action. Supporters argued that the gravity of the situation demanded a formal response, even if that response was unlikely to succeed. Both perspectives have merit, and both highlight the complicated nature of political action in a polarized environment. The constitutional mechanics of the 25th Amendment itself became a subject of intense discussion and analysis. Section 4, the provision everyone was talking about, has never been invoked against a president's will in the entire history of the United States. The process requires the vice president, in this case, J.D. Vance, to sign a written declaration along with a majority of the president's cabinet, meaning 8 of the 15 department heads. That declaration would then get sent to Congress, and the vice president would immediately become acting president. But here's where it gets truly complicated. If the president contests the declaration, which everyone agrees Trump absolutely would, Congress has 48 hours to assemble and then must vote by a 2/3 majority in both chambers to keep the president suspended. 2/3 in both chambers with a Republican-controlled Congress and a cabinet that the president himself appointed and could potentially fire. The numbers simply aren't there. Legal scholars have described Section 4 as the most difficult removal mechanism in the American constitutional system. Actually harder to use in practice than impeachment because it requires active buy-in from the president's own appointees. The political reality is that the people closest to the president, those in his cabinet and his vice president, would need to turn against him for the mechanism to work. And in the current political environment, that simply isn't happening. The administration's response to the entire controversy was predictable, but still noteworthy. Representative Marlin Stutzman called the Raskin bill madness and described calling for the 25th Amendment against one of the greatest presidents our nation has ever seen as the true madness. A White House spokesperson called Raskin's actions a distraction from what Democrats did or failed to do regarding Joe Biden's fitness concerns in 2024. That last point landed with considerable force because it highlighted a genuine hypocrisy charge that Democrats struggled to answer effectively. During the Biden era, when questions about the president's age and mental fitness were at their most visible and most documented, many of the same Democrats now loudly calling for a 25th Amendment commission had largely dismissed similar concerns. Republicans seized on this double standard and repeated it across Fox News, conservative media, and the floor of the House. A serious person can acknowledge that the double standard exists, while also asking separately and on its own merits whether the president's April 2026 posts genuinely raised legitimate fitness questions that deserve a serious answer, regardless of what happened with Biden. Both things can be true simultaneously. This is actually the most intellectually honest position to take on the issue, and it represents exactly the kind of nuanced thinking that cable news typically struggles to accommodate. The J.D. Vance dimension of this story cannot be overstated. Vance serves as the linchpin of everything related to the 25th Amendment. Under the current constitutional setup, Vance would need to be the one to sign the declaration that kicks off the Section 4 process. Even under the Raskin bill, with its commission structure doing the heavy lifting, Vance's agreement would still be required for any actual power transfer to occur. Vance has given no indication whatsoever that he is anywhere close to considering such a step. He has been publicly loyal to Trump throughout the Iran situation and through every controversy that preceded it, Politically, removing a president from his own party would be an extraordinary step that would almost certainly end Vance's political future within that party, regardless of how it played out legally or constitutionally. The calculation for Vance is simple and brutal. Supporting removal means becoming the most hated figure in the Republican base overnight, a pariah in his own party, a figure of contempt and anger from the grassroots activists who drove the party's success in recent elections. Not supporting removal means staying loyal, staying in position, and maintaining his political future within the party. For the 25th Amendment to become a real option rather than a political messaging tool, Vance would need to make a decision that is essentially politically suicidal within the world he inhabits. Every signal he has sent suggests he will not make that decision. The bigger picture here goes beyond the specific mechanics of the amendment or the political calculations of individual figures. What we are witnessing is a moment of constitutional gravity that reveals something fundamental about the current state of American politics. The fact that we are even having this conversation in 2026 about a sitting president's fitness for office tells you something important about how the political temperature has shifted. This isn't just Democrats making noise. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the president's most visible defenders, publicly calling for the 25th Amendment. This is the NAACP making a formal statement for the first time in the organization's entire history. This is Senator Ron Johnson, a Trump ally, expressing concern about civilian infrastructure and calling the rhetoric bluster. When you see that kind of range of voices all reacting to the same thing at the same time, you are witnessing something genuinely significant. The conversation itself is the story, not the action that might or might not follow. And it is not a small story. It is one of the most significant political moments of the year, not because of what it might lead to constitutionally, but because of what it reveals about the current state of American politics and presidential power. The questions being raised about fitness, about the limits of executive authority, about the relationship between presidential rhetoric and international stability. These are not questions that will disappear when the news cycle moves on. What happens next depends on factors that extend far beyond the current congressional session or the current administration. The formal bill sits in a Republican-controlled committee going nowhere. But the informal conversations are still happening, and those conversations will matter the next time something like this comes up. The 25th Amendment conversation didn't end in April. It didn't disappear when the news cycle moved on. It went underground, and underground, away from the cameras, is exactly where the most important political conversations happen. The legal and political frameworks established by this moment, the precedents being set, the boundaries being tested, all of it contributes to a broader evolution in how Americans think about presidential power and presidential fitness. Whether you view the April 2026 post as legitimate diplomatic pressure or genuinely alarming presidential behavior, the reaction they generated is a documented fact that will shape future discussions of presidential authority. The trigger was bipartisan in its effect. The response was bipartisan in its scope. And that combination is rare enough to matter. What we are watching is the conversation, not the action, and conversations still matter. They shift the political landscape even when they don't produce immediate results. They create new alliances and expose old fissures. They force people to take positions that will be remembered and referenced in future debates. The 25th Amendment has become a recurring political signal, rather than a genuine constitutional remedy in the minds of at least some of the people invoking it. When you treat a constitutional mechanism as a messaging tool repeatedly, and it repeatedly fails to go anywhere, you risk normalizing the language to the point where it loses its weight. Alternatively, you risk it becoming a partisan badge that the other side can wave back at you the moment their leader does something controversial. Democrats faced exactly that critique during the Biden era, when Republicans suggested Biden should be evaluated under the 25th Amendment for his own age-related concerns, and Democrats dismissed those calls. The Biden versus Trump double standard is now the first thing Republicans reach for every time Democrats invoke the amendment, and it is landing with considerable effect. That back and forth pattern does real damage to the credibility of the amendment as a serious governance tool, regardless of which party is doing the invoking. The conversation's happening right now. The formal bill introductions, the public statements from surprising figures, the constitutional analyses, all of it matters. Not because the 25th Amendment is about to be invoked, but because the very fact that we are discussing it tells us something important about where we are as a country. The temperature is running hotter than most mainstream coverage has been willing to say out loud. And that temperature will shape American politics for years to come, regardless of what happens to any specific piece of legislation or any particular constitutional provision. The political landscape of April 2026 will be studied by historians and political scientists for generations. The unlikely coalitions, the surprising statements, the constitutional conversations, all of it represents a moment when the normal rules of American politics were suspended, at least temporarily. The questions raised by this moment will not be easily answered. The tensions revealed will not be quickly resolved. But one thing is clear. The conversation about presidential fitness, about the limits of executive authority, about the relationship between presidential rhetoric and international stability, these conversations are not going away. They will evolve, they will shift, they will find new expressions and new contexts. But the underlying concerns that prompted so many people from so many different political perspectives to call for the 25th Amendment are concerns that will remain relevant for as long as the American presidency exists. The story of April 2026 is not really about whether the 25th Amendment will be invoked. Almost nobody serious thinks it will be. The story is about why so many people across such a wide political spectrum are talking about it at all. The breadth of the reaction, the diversity of voices involved, the speed with which the conversation developed, these are the data points that matter. These are the signals that tell us something real about where we are and where we might be heading. The next time something like this comes up, and there will be a next time, the precedents being set now will matter. The boundaries being tested now will define what is possible in future confrontations between presidents and the constitutional mechanisms designed to check their power. The 25th Amendment may not be invoked in April 2026, but the conversation about invoking it will echo through American politics for years to come. Stay tuned to this channel because we will continue following this story as it develops. The 25th Amendment conversation did not end in April. It did not disappear when the news cycle moved on. It went underground. And underground, away from the cameras, is exactly where the most important political conversations happen. The formal bill sits in a Republican-controlled committee going nowhere, but the informal conversations are still happening, and those conversations will matter the next time something like this comes up. This is not a story about partisan bickering or political gamesmanship. This is a story about the fundamental character of American democracy, about the limits of presidential power, about what happens when the constitutional mechanisms designed to check executive authority confront a political reality that makes those mechanisms almost impossible to use. It is a story that will continue to unfold in unexpected ways, and we will be here to tell it.